Elie and the blue Volvo. We were taking him from the airport to speak at a luncheon in downtown Cleveland. His presence in the back seat of my mother's blue Volvo sedan was at once weightless and ponderous. His name was Elie Wiesel. My cousin Danny sat beside him. He was a student of Elie's, working his way through the Jewish holy books. He called Elie rabbi, teacher, as they chatted quietly. It was Danny who had arranged for today's speech. I sat in the front next to my mother, my body turned so I could study Elie, though he wasn't the first person I'd met who had survived Hitler's savagery. I'd been to Israel for nearly 2 years in the late 60s and early 70s. It was commonplace in those days to see people on buses in short-sleeved shirts with concentration camp numbers tattooed on their forearms. And then there was 40-something Haim on the Galilean kibbutz, the communal farm where I was living. Haim was called Haimki, Little Haim, because he was barely 5 feet tall, though stout and very strong. His domain was the lul, with chickens, where he would throw heavy bags of feed over his shoulder and talk with his creatures in barely audible Yiddish. Haimki, had a number on his arm, but he did not wear his nightmare or his survival on his sleeve, though he certainly had a story which he would tell if asked in a soft way with respect at the right moment, usually while tending his newly hatched chicks. He had escaped from Auschwitz twice at the age of 15, the second time for good, snatched from the darkness and the rabid Nazi fire by a Polish family, hidden till the end of the war. Escaping for good, to come to Israel, to marry, have a daughter, name her Devorah, raise chickens, live a quiet life under the Jewish night for good, and tell his story from time to time when asked in a soft way, with respect, in a moment when the air was still, when for reasons I would never know, he could stand to recall the images, the feelings, the terror of being shot and falling into a ditch beneath so many other machine-gunned Jews, only to discover he was alive. Alive, the bullet having passed through the flesh above his hip. And so in darkness, he climbed from the gash in the ground filled with bodies, a gash that was not to be covered over until morning. So much for the vaunted Nazi efficiency. He climbed out from under the dead who had saved his life, climbed out and tunneled under the fence like a furious dog, ran for the woods in a flickering light with a pounding wish for shelter, for kindness, for life. Escape that place for good, that place for which there were no words, for the smell of fear and sweat and last breaths, no words for dead eyes fixed on a godless sky. He would tell this story sometimes while tending his chicks, if asked in a soft voice, with respect and hesitancy, but a yearning to know. Tell it with wonder on his face, as if he still couldn't believe nearly 3 decades later that the world had grown claws and fangs and hungered for Jewish blood, and still couldn't believe he had actually escaped that land that dwelled so far beyond the frontiers of terror and desperation. But mostly, Haimki just lived with energy, even effervescence, not sorrow, and talked about his daughter or his wife, or the beauty of the kibbutz community, or the best feed for his chicks, or how many stars you could see on a moonless night in the Jewish land. But Elie, in the back seat of my mother's blue Volvo sedan, Elie was different. He wore a long-sleeve shirt, jacket, and tie, his numbered arm hidden, but only his arm, not his anguish. Cavernous anguish in the lines descending from the corners of his nose. Cavernous anguish in the lines between his eyebrows and in his dark pupils. Cavernous anguish like the gaping mouths of the dead filled with night and fire. For though he was also 15 when captive, he had not escaped like Haim, but had suffered the claws, the fangs, the hunger for Jewish blood at Auschwitz and Buchenwald, where his father had finally withered into death. And then, beyond all hope, Elie had been liberated before a gash in the ground or a gas chamber or machine gun, rifle butt or bayonet, dysentery or starvation could end him. At the luncheon, he rose to speak, and I might have been forgiven for expecting the thunderous voice of God to blast from his lips for all he had experienced and witnessed. But that was not Elie. Soft tones, sometimes barely audible, flowed from him like hot honey, but within his voice, riding a wet, dark wind from far behind him, came many voices, voices within voices, anguish within anguish, filling every inch of the ballroom. His mission to speak for those who endured the unspeakable and could not tell their stories. And the warning implicit in them that this could happen again, though it might look different. But the human race has not been inoculated from this rampaging disease of cruelty. His mission filling the room, dark wind, dark waters rushing in until all of us, the audience, the servers, the busboys, all of us were gasping for air, tears etching our cheeks like streaks of ash from a falling sky. On the way back to the airport, once again, Cousin Danny sat with Elie in the back seat of my mother's blue Volvo. I sat in the front, turned so I could see him. His face transfixed me. Danny once again addressed him as Rabbi and asked a question about a passage from one of the holy books. Elie answered him with patience and affection in his soft, near-whispering voice. I was astonished he could travel in a matter of minutes from the incomprehensible murders of Auschwitz and Buchenwald to the back seat of the Volvo to answer my cousin's question. And I thought, his heart has been shattered, and still he loves. How is that possible? It has been nearly 50 years since that day. Elie is gone. My mom is gone. The blue Volvo is long gone. And yet recently, I have seen them. Elie, Mom, the Volvo, as I have seen stories of entire people exiled from their land, stories of parents and children treated as parasites, separated and caged, stories of bullets spraying through malls, open-air markets, weddings, nightclubs, concerts, schools, churches, synagogues, the rapacity of the Nazis returning, only clothed differently and media savvy. And I have seen them floating through images of the Amazon screaming, the glaciers screaming, the coral screaming, hurricanes, tornadoes, and drought, screaming, whole species vanishing, everywhere throats full of rage, amidst the stupid, deaf malevolence of mankind against itself and everything around it. Images of a world that cannot be escaped for a greater good, as Haim had from Auschwitz. I see the blue Volvo floating by like a ghost ship in the middle of these stories, my mom behind the wheel, and Elie in the back seat gazing through the window, eyes so forlorn and yet so compassionate, hands pressed against the window, his anguished lips moving, but his words inaudible for all the screaming in the world. My body bends toward him, yearning for his voice and the voices within his voice, and the stories that might teach us, make us better against all odds. I tremble for humanity, run to an empty beach as far from the screaming images as possible. I scan the blue sky for glimpses of God and find only absence and silence. But here on this beach, at least I can remember. I can remember being in the front seat of my mother's blue Volvo on the way to the Cleveland airport, transfixed by Elie, who has traveled from Auschwitz and Buchenwald in a matter of moments as he answers my cousin's questions with such patience, such warmth. And I can remember thinking, as if it were happening right now, his heart has been shattered, and still he loves. How is that possible?